So welcome, bienvenue, willkommen. So welcome to International Conscientious Objector Day from Leicester, the Leicester International. And here is the Edwin Lutyens Memorial Arch for those who died in World War I and onwards. And if we go down the path, the avenue, you will see a sign that says Peace Walk. And if you walk down this Peace Walk, you come to the Conscientious Objector Stone, to the 250 or more known and unknown individuals from Leicester and Leicestershire who refused to fight in World War I. Today we were here for 4 hours in 4 different shifts, sharing leaflets with people to help people understand what was happening today. Our theme on this International Conscientious Objector Day is I am a conscientious objector for life. And we will be thinking about that theme. We are remembering both the moment or the period when young people were conscientious objectors, but then we're remembering also the rest of their ethical life. We come now to our first story, the founding of the Fellowship of Reconciliation. And we are going to have that told to us by Davorka Lovovakovich, who's a German Quaker who has served the Fellowship of Reconciliation in a number of leadership roles. And she also served as General Secretary of Church and Peace, the European Ecumenical Peace Church Network. So I'm going to ask Davorka now to share.
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you for inviting me. In July 1914, theologians and ecumenical activists from 12 countries representing 30 denominations gathered in Constance, Germany, to find ways to work against the war, which everyone seemed to anticipate. The murder in Sarajevo had already set off governments on a path to war. During their conference, the German government also declared war, and the gathering was dissolved by the authorities. Everyone had to leave Germany. German Lutheran pastor Friedrich Sigmund Schulze and English Quaker Henry Hodgkin traveled together, and in Cologne they changed trains. Parting, they said, "We are one in Christ, and therefore we can never be at war." Upon returning, both set out acting on that vow they had made. Henry Hodgkin and British Quakers wrote a pamphlet, Message to Men and Women of Goodwill, and 475,000 were distributed in no time. On August 8th, the message appeared in paid advertisements in 9 leading newspapers. A copy reached Germany, and it also circulated there. In this moment, they effectively founded the Fellowship of Reconciliation that was formally organized at the University of Cambridge in 1914 later. And the German branch was established as an organization only after the war. In 1919, International Fellowship of Reconciliation was founded nearby Utrecht in the Netherlands. From the beginning, a rather modern name was chosen for this new movement, and a quite challenging one at that, Fellowship of Reconciliation. The founding fathers and mothers had an understanding that if you stand up against state and military, especially when at war, you needed more than membership of a peace organization. You needed a community of dedicated people to support each other. As people of faith, they also understood that a no to military needs a yes, a yes to peace, justice, equality, building bridges to those labeled as enemies, all of the biblical shalom. 1916, the opposition to war forced not only Britain to start compulsory conscription, but they were also the first to formulate a right to conscientious objection. FOR was part of the opposition, and today, more than 100 years later, the fellowship continues to take a clear stand on that issue. Opposition to war is the clearest when men and women refuse to not engage with the military. But the right to conscientious objection has not yet been established everywhere. On the contrary, in many countries, prosecution and prison are still in use. On behalf of the more than 70 member organizations spread around the globe, IFOR continues to lobby for the right to conscientious objection at the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva, and this work is one of the top priorities of their international work. And I also want to add that at the moment, the German FOR is having its annual conference online, as we all meet online. And I want to convey the greetings from our members to you who are here on this other screen, listening and sharing and celebrating the brave men and women who say no to military. Thank you.
Thank you, Devorka, very much for sharing that. In Britain, 75% at least of the conscientious objectors in World War I were socialists of one kind or another. And so our first song, O Spirit of All Nations, is sung by the Red Leicester Choir, a socialist choir. Red Leicester is also a cheese, so they're playing with words here. And it's conducted by Jain Burnsall. So if you mute yourself, you'll be able to see the words and you can join in the choir.
This is my song, O Spirit of all nations, a song of peace for lands afar and wide. This is my home, my country where my heart is. Here are my hopes, my dreams, my holy shrine. But alas, in other lands of eating, with hopes and dreams as true and high as mine. My country's skies are bluer than the ocean, and sunlight streams on clover, leaf, and pine. But alas, have sunlight too and clover, and skies are everywhere as blue as mine. Oh, hear my song, thou Spirit of all nations, a song of peace for their land and for mine.
Next story is also from Leicester, the Eagle Brothers and Jack Abbott. were members of the Leicester Secular Society, and Anthony Matthew, also known as Matt, who was at the Conscientious Objector Stone leafleting today, is going to tell their story. Matt, over to you.
Good evening. For the centenary of the First World War, Leicester Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament produced a book uncovering resistance about local conscientious objectors. Of the 250 names on the list, there is religious information on 90. Of those, 86 mention religion, while 2 say no religion, 1 person mentions the secular society, and 1 is an agnostic. This information, though, is far from complete and not wholly accurate. The Eagle brothers from Leicester demonstrate the limitation of this data. They were known to be members of the secular society, and yet this does not appear on their records, and Edgar is recorded as a Wesleyan. Edgar and Ronald Eagle were both secularists and members of the No Conscription Fellowship and the Union for Democratic Control. They were arrested under the Military Service Act for neglecting to report to the barracks at South Wixton, a suburb of Leicester, in May 1916. 18 other men appeared in court with them that same day. They had applied to the appeal tribunal for total exemption, but were refused and granted non-combatant status, and were liable to be called up into the army, but not to be trained to use weapons. They believed that any alternative service still supported the war effort and in effect supported the immoral pursuit of war. All of the men were fined 40 shillings and handed over to the military authorities. Edgar had been ordered to join the non-combatant Corps Northern 3 unit in June 1916. While in Glen Parva, barracks near Leicester, he was given 28 days field punishment number 2 for disobeying orders. This involved being tied in chains and shackled to a heavy object, often a wheel. In a second court-martial at Catterick in April 1917, he was given 2 years hard labour at Wormwood Scrubs. After 3 months, however, he was sent to a work centre set up in Dartmoor Prison. Ronald Eagle, his brother, spent 56 days in detention in Stafford Barracks for refusing to turn out on parade. After serving time at Wormwood Scrubs, he was also transferred to Dartmoor. Another rather different case. Some men with families may have felt they had little choice but to respond to the call-up and decided they would resist quietly and avoid killing. Jack Abbott may have been such a man. He was a secularist who went to the front, but when he came home on leave, decided he could no longer go back, even though that meant he would face the risk of being shot for desertion. With his wife and 2 young sons, he went to London and hid in an attic whilst his wife worked as a dressmaker to support them. They returned to Leicester in the 1920s and were active again in the secular society. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. So that was a secular society story. And now we come to Albert Worth, Enfield, London, his story, and his granddaughter is going to share that, Claire Olivieri. Claire, over to you.
Thank you, Andrew. I'm very grateful to have been asked to tell the story of Albert Worth, or Grandpa to me, who was my grandfather on my dad's side. My earliest memories of Grandpa are from around when I was about 4 years old, and we lived with him and my grandma in Hymes Park, East London, while our house in Enfield was renovated and Mum was on bed rest, pregnant with my brother. I remember things like the rhubarb that he grew at the end of his garden, travelling in his car on the way to church or school. And then later on, when Grandma had died, Grandpa would alternate between our house and my aunt's house on Sundays for lunch, between the morning and evening worships at church. He would also come on holiday with us and enjoyed a pot of tea and a slice of cake at many stately homes, castles, nature reserves and beaches that we would visit, usually in Dorset or the Suffolk coast. When the Second World War started, Albert applied for Conscientious Objector status. Others from Community of Christ also objected. Among these were Frank Judd and Albert's brother Tom Worth. Both of these men were able to gain clergy exemption as they were ordained ministers with sacramental authority. Many of these men took on other peaceful roles for the war effort, and I know that Frank Judd was a fire warden. As Albert, or Grandpa, wasn't yet ordained, there was no clergy legal status that he could apply for, and so he was called to state his case at a tribunal in Bayswater, London, as a conscientious objector. He was supported at the tribunal by the pastor of the Enfield congregation, Peter Whalley, who was also a former soldier. The panel for Grandpa's tribunal didn't make it easy. He was questioned on why he thought he should be allowed to be exempt from his duty in the war effort, and he simply stated, "I conscientiously object to any military service for the reason that fighting is against my conscience and is contrary to the gospel of Jesus Christ. Moreover, a man-made war cannot make peace." This alone didn't satisfy the tribunal, and they further questioned him, testing his commitment to his statement. And they asked him what he would do if an enemy soldier were to come into his home and threaten his wife with a gun. He responded that he would stand between his wife, Vera, and the enemy soldier. The final decision of the tribunal was that his name be removed from the official register of conscientious objectors, and he would be liable to be called up, but only for non-combatant duties. That's why you would have seen him in a soldier's uniform in the picture, but he was in the non-combatant corps and he didn't have a gun or any weapon. So he worked in bomb disposal, carrying out extremely dangerous bomb disposal work for 2.5 years. And there were plenty of bombs in London to work on. Albert also lost his job in his building firm because the other employees found out that he was an objector and they insisted that they wouldn't work alongside him. However, he did find further employment in the building trade after the war, and he had a good career as a general foreman, working on many buildings in the city. And he was recognised for this work, being awarded the prestigious Freedom of the City of London for the work he did restoring the Guildhall. I also know that in his paid work after the war, he was known as Holy Joe by the other employees and colleagues because of his refusal to swear, tell a lie, or even drink alcohol, which was quite unusual with all the other workmen there on the building sites. Albert was called to be an ordained minister after the war, and also served as the pastor for the Enfield congregation for a number of years. Again, this was in a voluntary capacity. I remember Grandpa preaching on occasions, but I also remember his ministry towards the end of his life would be to pick up and drop home the older ladies that didn't have cars and lived too far from church to walk. Everything Albert did, he did with a kind and gentle spirit, always sticking absolutely to his Christian principles. He was certainly a conscientious objector for life. Thanks, Andrew.
Thank you, Claire. I remember the kindness of your grandfather. So that was a Community of Christ story. Now we come to a Catholic story. In Nelson, not very far from where I grew up in Lancashire, Thomas and Peter Allen. And telling this story is Teresa Alessandro, who lives in Leicester, a wonderful colleague in the peace movement here, and former Pax Christi coordinator. Teresa, please tell us this story.
Thank you. Good evening. So Peter and Thomas Allen were Roman Catholic brothers from Nelson, the town in Lancashire, at the time of the First World War. They refused to join the army. Their family had a long history of anti-war activism. Their father had been involved in opposing the Boer War, And actually, the town of Nelson had quite a strong anti-war activist history at the time. So in April 1916, having refused conscription, they were brought before the magistrates' court in Nelson, fined 40 shillings, and handed over to the military. As with many other conscientious objectors, and we've heard a little already this evening, the military began a heavy-handed process of trying to break their resolve. They were imprisoned, where they were treated brutally, released back into the military, and then imprisoned again for continuing to refuse to obey military orders. This cycle was repeated many times, and their health was seriously damaged. In December 1918, the Conscientious Objector newspaper, the Tribunal, reported that Peter and Thomas were briefly released from prison to attend their mother's funeral. When they reached Nelson, their hometown, other members of the family were ill, and Peter and Thomas, already in poor health, also fell ill and quickly died. The Tribunal newspaper reported that this scenario had become common since conscientious objectors were, and I'm quoting now, malnourished, denied exercise, and kept in cramped, filthy conditions, suffering from mental and physical anguish, from where they would be released while already near fatally ill. So many, like Peter and Thomas, were unable to survive the wave of disease that accompanied the end of the war. If you visit Barrowford Cemetery near Nelson today, you can find a Commonwealth War grave headstone inscribed with the names Peter Allen and Thomas Allen, listing a rank and regiment. I spoke to Valerie Flessati, who is an expert on First World War conscientious objectors, along with Cyril Pearce. And Valerie reported that even though they were conscientious objectors and spent the war in prison, they were regarded as being in the army. So they got an official military headstone. And Valerie described this as the final insult. We don't have any records of writings or clear statements by Peter and Thomas or their brother James, who also refused military conscription. We can piece together something of the story of their resistance, though, and I'm grateful to the Peace Pledge Union database, the men who said no, for most of this information. We know that Peter and Thomas followed their conscience and resisted participation in the war, despite the great costs to their health, their livelihoods, and their freedom. We can acknowledge that Catholic conscientious objectors did not have public support from the Catholic Church hierarchy. We can observe that the authorities did not treat their status as conscientious objectors with respect and failed to acknowledge their courageous stand, even in marking their deaths. But here today, we can respect and be inspired by Peter and Thomas Allen, who died within a couple of days of each other all those years ago, conscientious objectors to the end.
Thank you, Teresa.
Thank you.
So we go now from Lancashire to Josei Toda, a Buddhist leader imprisoned in Japan in World War II. And a friend, Carl Hudson from Soka Gakkai, UK, Leicestershire, is going to share that story. Carl, over to you.
Thank you, Andrew. Hi, everyone. Thanks for giving me the opportunity to speak today about Josei Toda and Daisaku Ikeda and SGI, specifically in relation to nuclear weapons. So Soka Gakkai International, or SGI, is a lay Buddhist organisation practising the teachings of Nichiren Daishonin, who lived in 13th century Japan. Nichiren established the chanting of Nam-myoho Renge Kyo based on the Lotus Sutra. If we fast forward to the early 1900s, a teacher named Tsunasaburo Makaguchi formed the Soka Gakkai in Japan in 1930. Makaguchi was the first president of Soka Gakkai, and in 1920 met Mr. Toda, who was later to become second Soka Gakkai president. Mr. Makaguchi and Mr. Toda were imprisoned in World War II for refusing to give in to the demands of the militarist authorities in Japan, who wanted them to merge aspects of the Shinto religion with Nichiren Buddhism. Shinto at that time was being used to control the people. Sadly, Mr. Makaguchi died in prison, but Mr. Toda emerged in 1945, and until his death in 1958, poured his whole life into rebuilding and strengthening the Soka Gakkai. Daisaku Ikeda was 19 years old when he met Mr. Toda in 1947 and stood by Toda's side, doing everything he could to support the efforts to rebuild the Soka Gakkai. Mr. Toda became Ikeda's mentor in faith and life, and Mr. Ikeda went on to become the third Soka Gakkai president and lead the worldwide development of SGI. So that's a bit of background, but the main thing I wanted to talk about today is Mr. Toda's 1957 declaration calling for the abolition of nuclear weapons and the effect it had on his disciple, Mr. Ikeda, and the organisation of the SGI. It was just 7 months before his death, at a meeting of 50,000 young Soka Gakkai members in Japan, that Mr. Toda made his declaration calling for the abolition of nuclear weapons. It was during the height of the Cold War between East and West, when both sides were scrambling to test and develop these weapons. Mr. Toda deeply pondered the situation, and partly because his health was failing, he decided the time was ripe to leave a declaration against nuclear weapons to encourage especially the youth to fight for the banning of them. In his thinking about these weapons, he realised that they are not the same as other forms of weaponry because of their potential for destroying all life on planet Earth. He saw that if we held on to the idea of nuclear deterrence, nations would be caught up in the idea that they had to have these weapons in order to be secure. There isn't time today, unfortunately, to share what Mr. Toda said in that declaration, but suffice it to say it was very powerful, had a really strong effect on all the young people gathered there, and made his position on nuclear weapons crystal clear. Since that day, determined to make his mentor's vision a reality, Mr. Ikeda has sought out paths to nuclear abolition and the construction of a culture of peace through engaging in dialogue with leading thinkers and decision makers, as well as writing annual peace proposals since 1983 in support of the ideals of the United Nations. Mr. Ikeda is quoted as saying, "If we are to put the era of nuclear terror behind us, we must struggle against the real enemy. That enemy is not nuclear weapons per se, nor is it the states that possess or develop them. The real enemy that we must confront is the ways of thinking that justify nuclear weapons, the readiness to annihilate others when they are seen as a threat or a hindrance to the realisation of our objectives." The SGI has collaborated with global anti-nuclear movements such as the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, ICAN. The exhibition, Everything You Treasure, for a world free from nuclear weapons, was jointly created by SGI and ICAN. Now that the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons has come into force, nuclear weapons are illegal under international law. Thank you so much. Let's work together in our beautiful diversity to create a sustainable future of peace. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Carl, for that very important story. In fact, Carl and I met through our joint interest in the disturbing presence of nuclear weapons. We now come to a story from Jainism, Ahimsa and Gandhi, and the Jain temple here in Leicester is the first Jain temple, I believe, outside of India. And we have Viral Dagli, who is a member of this Jain community, who's going to tell us something about Jainism, Gandhi, and Ahimsa. So Viral is a solicitor, and we warmly welcome you, Viral, to this conversation. Over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Andrew, for your warm welcome and the invitation to the Jain community to be part of this wonderful event. May I also extend my gratitude to you personally for helping me prepare for this event. And it's meant a great deal to me to be able to learn so much about conscientious objectors and the movement and the stories that people have gone through. When Andrew and I were talking about this event, we discussed that this is almost an opportunity for us to build bridges within two established communities in Leicester. But I appreciate that some of you may not have come across Jainism before. So by way of a quick introduction, Jainism is a faith, it's a way of life really, that originated in India. And whilst the faith has many ancient origins, many stories of ancient tradition, many of the key principles are substantiated by science. But the central and key principle of Jainism is ahimsa, which means non-violence. And this extends through actions, words, and thoughts. There are lots of the principles in Jainism that feed into this central idea of being a non-violent person. So, for example, there's Shama, which means forgiveness. There's Apahigra, which means detachment. And there's Anekantvad, which means multiplicity points of view. So on that last point, for example, if you imagine 5 blind men touching an elephant, then each person is going to feel something different. One blind man might touch the leg of an elephant and feel it to be something close to a tree trunk. Another blind man might touch the tusk and think of it to be a marble object. And each of them is correct in their own way. That's their experience, but it's only one aspect of the truth. And the truth is often multifaceted and has multi aspects to it. And that shapes their experience. And it's all of these principles that feed into this idea of non-violence. There are lots of different scriptures in Jainism, and they, in time, tell what we believe to be the words of the forward makers that we call our gods, the Tirthankars. And one of the quotes from the texts are that there are weapons superior to each other available for everybody, but nothing is more superior than disarmament and non-violence. And non-violence is the overriding principle. And it is this principle that inspired a Jain poet called Srimad Rajchandra. And Srimad Rajchandra had a huge amount of self-realization as to the world, and he understood this principle of non-violence in a huge amount of depth. And on the 6th of July, 1891, he met Mahatma Gandhi. And in this meeting, and in subsequent meetings, Srimad Rajchandra explained this idea of non-violence, explained the importance of non-violence to Mahatma Gandhi. And when reading Mahatma Gandhi's biography, it is clear that he was very inspired by these ideas of non-violence. And some of these ideas are what led to him designing the Satyagraha movement, which was the movement, the non-violence resistance that helped bring India to independence. And it's an example of how a non-violent movement can also facilitate change. This was just my whistle-stop tour, if you like, of the principles of non-violence in Jainism. And I have to say, I've been able to learn so much more from hearing from your stories today. I do hope we get an opportunity to meet in person. You're all welcome to the Jain Centre. And I look forward to listening to the rest of the programme. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Viral. So perhaps I should just say that Jainism really flourished at the same time as Buddhism came forth, at a time of great violence and conflict and war So they're the Quakers of India, Buddhism and Jainism. And I love what Gandhi said, in a gentle way, you can shake the world, shake the politicians. We come now to Cyril Pierce. Cyril Pierce lives in Huddersfield, an academic, historian, who first did a book or his master's thesis, his MPhil, on Huddersfield as a center of resistance in World War I, filled with conscientious objectors and different groups, many of whom are represented today, resisting the conscription and resisting the war, and finding community support. This latest book by Cyril Pierce, Communities of Resistance, surveys the whole of Britain. Carefully crafted, amazingly researched. And it's now to invite Cyril to give us some conclusions from what he learned from studying communities of resistance in Britain in World War I. Cyril, over to you. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you very much for those nice remarks about the book and about my work. In the late 1960s, when I first began working on Britain's 1914-1918 war resistors, in spite of Joan Littlewood's wonderful film, Oh, What a Lovely War, and in spite of David Bolton's essential book, Objection Overruled, if people thought about war resistors at all, what they had in mind was men, conscientious objectors to military service, and the stories of their resistance, and men who were individuals, principled and determined, it's true, but ultimately marginal, very much a minority, unsuccessful, and of course, in many respects, the wartime propaganda portrayed them as somehow a little bit strange. The work I've been doing since then, and particularly over the last 20 years, and you see in the book that you spoke so kindly of, has begun to tell a very different story. Firstly, that the men, the conscientious objectors, were not lone individuals. We've heard something of that from the contribution about some Leicester conscientious objectors. They were in fact supported by vigorous war resistor communities, some of which were sufficiently well organized and numerous to make a real impact on local attitudes to the war, anti-war hotspots, and war resistor regions, if you like. This is true in Leicester, as it was in Bristol, Birmingham, the West Riding, Pennine, Lancashire, where of course Nelson has pride of place, North London, and in parts of South Wales and Scotland. All of them either regions of resistance or regions of accumulations of anti-war hotspots. The second thing, I think, that's come very much out of the work of the last 20 or 30 years is that these communities were made up of local branches of national anti-war organizations, all working together. We've heard about the Fellowship of Reconciliation, the Union of Democratic Control, the National Council of Civil Liberties has its origins in this time, and above all, the No Conscription Fellowship. Their members came from widely different social backgrounds. Very different, for example, the Quaker ladies of Croydon petitioning the Home Secretary to be allowed to send Christmas puddings to the conscientious objectors in Worwood Scrubs from the steel workers and tin workers of South Wales. They were mostly Christian, mostly nonconformists, some of them Roman Catholic, but a very small minority, Congregationalists, Methodists, Quakers, but in London, Leeds and Manchester, they were joined by members of Jewish communities, which again, like the Catholic community, were not favorably looked upon by the leaders of the Jewish community. All of them came from different political perspectives. We'll find anarchists, socialists, internationalists of one kind or another, radical liberals, but all made common cause against the war and in support of conscientious objectors. Above all, it is now very clear that war resistance, 1914 to 1918, and subsequently, was not an all-male affair. Among its leading figures nationally and locally were a great many women. They kept the anti-war campaign going when the men were taken away. They supported the conscientious objectors and their families when they went to prison. And finally, it's important to remember, and I think the research shows very clearly, the war resistor movement did not go away when the war ended. Its men and women helped recreate and sustain the peace movement beyond 1918 and made major contributions to British politics at local and parliamentary levels. Indeed, more than 50 of the Labour MPs elected at the 1929 general election had been members of the First World War's anti-war community, some of them conscientious objectors, others anti-war activists of one kind or another. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that wonderful and helpful summary. So I'm going to just reflect a little bit on what Cyril has been saying. What have I learned from Cyril that is relevant for today, for you and I on this call? First of all, belong to a progressive peace group committed to nonviolence. Secondly, work with allies, even if you have differences. Together, create communities of resistance that support those willing to be, as it were, stormtroopers for justice and peace. One American scholar of conscientious objectors in World War I said it was the conscientious objectors who were the stormtroopers of dissent and resistance to the war. So we should continue in our city and in our country and in our world, in all our diversity, to work for peace. I'm so pleased that Viral caught up on that. So that's why today we've heard stories told from a diversity of background: socialist, different kinds of Christian, Buddhist, and also Jainism, and also secularists. We have remembered together today, and we can continue to work together in the future for a more just and gentle world. As Gandhi said, we can shake the world and the powers that misrule us gently. We still need conscientious objectors against war, but also objecting to poverty, neoliberalism, climate change, racism, nationalism, fascism, sexism, all prejudices that dehumanize others, including immigrant phobia, homophobia, and transphobia. It's my pleasure now to invite Karen Norton, who's a master's student at Leicester University studying human rights law, to say a little bit about European rights and conscientious objection today. So, Karen, over to you.
Thank you very much. And thank you this evening as I share about 2 minutes of information with you. I want to talk to you about the European Convention on Human Rights, and specifically Article 9. And I do apologize. I don't know if Leicester has one, but there are fireworks going off in my neighborhood, so I do apologize. So to draw your attention to Article 9, it states, everyone has the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. And this includes the right to manifest your religion or belief in worship, teaching, practice, and observance. However, unfortunately, Article 9 does not include conscientious objection. State parties to the convention do not have to legally recognize conscientious objectors, and they are not obligated by law. And this has led to multiple cases of countries across the European Union taken to court at Strasbourg, or the Court of European Human Rights. And these cases are as recent as 2020, a recent case from Russia. And it was stated that there was no violation of Article 9. And the majority of the reasons why these cases show up with no violation of Article 9, even though they're expressing a religious thought or their conviction, is because they cannot find a genuine held religious or other belief or conviction. They believe that it's not serious enough to be able to be guaranteed by Article 9 of their manifesting their religion through their observance or their practice. Another thing is that it's recognized through domestic courts. So the applicant, the person that is applying, that there is a violation of Article 9 in their country. The court at Strasbourg gives countries a margin of appreciation. So if the domestic court states that it doesn't give any leeway with conscientious objection, the court usually sides with the country, unless they can find a violation of Article 3 of torture or another violation along with it, which is causing quite a lot of frustration because there are many, many cases that come through, and sometimes it takes years before these cases can even get to Strasbourg. So sometimes we think of conscientious objection of something that happened in World War I or World War II, and it's continuing today. So I just want us to be mindful of this. This includes throughout Europe. France is an example where they're starting to have a universal national service, and this is for teenagers from 15 to 17, and it's voluntary at the moment, but they're looking at making it compulsory by 2022. And this is currently a civil service, so this is a voluntary program within France. And President Macron has said that it's a way to develop patriotism and social coercion. So this is something just to be mindful of the fact that people today are still fighting conscientious objection, even in Europe, even though we do have Article 9. That gives us this right of thought, of conscience and religion, but we're still continuing to help those who are marginalized and those who are conscientious objectors today. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. So our theme, I'm a conscientious objector for life, was suggested to us by our closing speaker, Kees Neuwirth from the Netherlands. Kees is a Quaker, a Church and Peace board member, and vice president of the Council of Churches in the Netherlands. He's a feisty Dutchman who courageously will give us some challenging words at the end of our time together. Kees, over to you.
During the 1960s, whilst a student in the times of the often riotous demonstrations against the Vietnam War, I stumbled upon the peaceful protest by the Quakers in the form of a silent vigil and became a convinced friend and a convinced Quaker. As the Netherlands still had conscription those days, I was called up for military service and naturally became a conscientious objector. A conscientious objector for life. A convinced Quaker, convicted to be a long life peace activist, or should I say convicted to be a conscientious objector for life. Not just for the 2 years of my period of civil service, during which I was working in development cooperation in Kenya with the Dutch equivalent of the Peace Corps. Later, I became involved with the Peace Tax campaign, as this might provide another way to actually become not just a conscientious objector for the duration of the civil service, but for life. And not just for men, but also for women. And so I became the founding president of the Conscience and Peace Tax International at a meeting in Hondarribia in Spain. As I am well aware that the proposals for bills recognizing this right of conscientious objection to taxation for military purposes so far has little support from parliaments across Europe, another way forward might be to lobby for the extension of the recognition of conscientious objection to military service by the UN, with a recognition of the right to object to taxation for military service, for military taxation. If we could achieve that, member states of the UN would have to provide for legislation to that effect. Ever since my CO days, I have been witnessing to the peace testimony by working against war and militarism, the arms trade, nuclear arms, nationalism, racism, and populism, and for true peace, just peace, and inclusive peace, for a sustainable future for all. Not just at the local and national level, but also at the international level, particularly through my engagement in the European Ecumenical Peace Movement, Church and Peace, the Conference of European Churches, and the World Council of Churches. Since I am convinced that our struggle against war and militarism should be embedded in a positive alternative, I also co-founded an initiative in the Netherlands called Working Group on Inclusive Security, which is linked to a similar German initiative called Sicherheit neu denken, and a British one called Rethinking Security. Check them out on internet. They're all there. Perhaps we might eventually link peace movements in a growing number of European countries to effect a fundamental shift towards true peace. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Kees. So I want to thank all our speakers. I want to thank our translators for their excellent translations and willing and cheerful way of doing that. We're going to finish with a song sung by Global Harmony, Melton Mowbray. Melton Mowbray is near Leicester in the county of Leicestershire. It makes wonderful Stilton cheese. And the conductor of this choir is Carl Hudson from Soko Gakkai, who spoke earlier. He's a conductor to about 3 community choirs in Leicestershire.
We